You've heard of Viking raids and Viking kings, but what about Viking diplomacy? Tonight we dive into a surprising chapter of Viking history where heated negotiations didn't take place in grand halls, but in the sweaty, steamy rooms of saunas. Believe me, you're going to sweat this one out, but not in the way you think. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where sweat and negotiation go hand in hand. It's ancient Viking times, and instead of shields and swords, we're talking about the power of the sauna. You probably didn't expect that, right? Picture this. The crisp, cold winds of Scandinavia biting at your skin, but inside a cozy wooden building, things are heating up, literally. Vikings, who are notorious for their battles and brutal raids, found themselves sitting side by side with their rivals in a sauna. Yes, you heard that right. The Viking equivalent of a diplomatic summit, a sweaty sauna session. But trust me, this wasn't just about sweating off the day's stress. This was serious diplomacy. Viking chiefs would meet in these steaming rooms, half naked, sweaty and exhausted, negotiating deals, forging alliances, and sometimes even making decisions that could decide the fate of entire nations. Can you imagine the discomfort? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a deep breath as you imagine yourself in a Viking sauna. The heat is intense, and you can hear the rhythmic clang of the hot stones being splashed with water. The steam fills the air, thick and heavy, mingling with the scent of wood and sweat. The Vikings, hardened warriors and skilled diplomats alike, settle into the heat of the room. It's not about being comfortable. It's about enduring, about showing your strength in the face of discomfort. As you sit down, you notice the room is silent for a moment. But then, a low voice breaks the stillness. A Viking leader speaks. To a rival chief across the sauna, both men drenched in sweat but wearing calm, serious expressions. They're not talking about battle tactics or raids. No, they're discussing a truce, a peace deal that could save lives and secure trade routes. And as you watch them sweat it out, you can't help but wonder, does the sauna help them reach an agreement, or is it just an ancient way to make the heat of negotiation more literal? Before you know it, the steam builds, and you begin to feel the pressure, the sweat trickling down your face and the sense of unease that comes from trying to make an important decision under such extreme conditions. And yet, this was how Vikings had been conducting diplomacy for centuries, a test of endurance. Ever wondered why Vikings didn't just sit in a fancy meeting room to negotiate peace? Well, grab your towel, because tonight we're diving into the legendary sauna tradition that made Viking diplomacy as hot as the steam in their steam rooms. You're probably wondering, why a sauna? Well, Vikings weren't exactly known for their subtlety, right? They liked to make a statement, and what better way to do that than by having high-stakes discussions while sweating it out in a cramped, steamy room? The tradition of using saunas for negotiation was deeply embedded in Viking culture, and it wasn't just about getting sweaty for the sake of it. Saunas were sacred places, believed to have a special power. They weren't simply places for cleaning up after a long day of raiding or pillaging. They were also places where Vikings would strip away their armor, both physically and metaphorically. In a sauna, you weren't a warrior, you weren't a leader, and you weren't an enemy. You were just another person. Can you imagine sitting in a steamy room, surrounded by your enemies, both of you naked, sweating it out in a battle of wills? It was less about what was being said, and more about the vibe. The challenge of being able to endure the heat, the discomfort, and the psychological pressure that came with negotiating in such an intense environment. There was a real tradition of hospitality tied to the sauna as well. Viking leaders would invite their counterparts to these heated meetings, signaling that they were ready to make peace and resolve conflicts. It wasn't just a practical arrangement, it was a statement. If you could survive a sauna session with your rival, well then surely you could survive any battle with them in the future, right? The sauna's significance went far beyond a mere ritual of cleanliness. In Viking society, it symbolized purification, a way to clear your body and soul before making important decisions. The heat was intense, but the tension was often even more unbearable. As you sit there, feeling the sweat dripping down your back, you begin to understand why the sauna was such a perfect place for Viking diplomacy. The heat wasn't just physical, it was mental. And in those moments when your body was at its breaking point, the mind had to step in and negotiate its own peace. But let's be real here. This was also a bit of a power move. The Vikings didn't just want to win battles, they wanted to show dominance even in negotiations. Can you imagine making a deal with someone who was sweating bullets next to you, fighting to stay calm while negotiating over something life-changing? It was a true test of character. Who could stay cool? Who would crack under pressure? So, before they even began talking about land treaties or trade agreements, the Vikings already knew one thing. The sauna would separate the strong from the weak, the honest from the deceitful. What happens when you throw Viking leaders, rivals, and a steaming sauna together in one room? Let's find out as we explore how the contrast between a cold land and hot diplomacy shaped the Viking way of making peace. Now, imagine the cold, biting winds of Scandinavia. It's freezing outside, with snow covering the vast landscapes, and yet in these wooden saunas, the temperature is cranked up to the max. The extreme cold of the Nordic world stands in stark contrast to the intense heat of the sauna. And this wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a way of life. For the Vikings, living in the cold, harsh climates of Scandinavia made them adapt in ways that other cultures didn't have to. Their whole existence was built on enduring the extreme conditions, both physical and emotional. So, what better place to conduct a serious diplomatic negotiation than a sauna? The heat tested not only their physical endurance, but also their mental strength, and if you could withstand it, you were considered worthy of respect. This clash between cold and heat was symbolic of the Viking mindset. Outside, the world was cold, unforgiving, and harsh, but inside the sauna, there was intensity and pressure. The room was small, and the heat could easily become unbearable. And it wasn't just about sweating it out. It was about showing resilience in the face of discomfort. It was about testing resolve in the most intense setting possible. And let's not forget the psychological aspect of it. You're sitting there in the midst of rivals, sweating in silence, with only the sound of water splashing on the hot stones to break the tension. The heat made everything feel more intense. It wasn't just about surviving the sauna. It was about who could hold their composure, who could stay calm under pressure, who would crack first. You could say the sauna represented the Viking view of life itself, a constant battle between extremes, a test of who could endure the most, who could stay strong in the face of adversity. And that's what made these meetings so fascinating. It wasn't just about the words they exchanged, it was about how the environment itself tested their strength, their resolve, and their ability to negotiate and compromise under intense pressure. The Vikings had a saying, "Endure the cold to know the heat." It wasn't just a phrase, it was a mindset. They understood that the cold made the heat sweeter, and that the struggle for peace, the work of diplomacy, had to be done with tenacity, strength, and sometimes sweat. So what was at stake? The heat wasn't the only thing that could break someone. Sometimes the sweat made them think clearly, or in some cases, made them crack. What happens when your body is pushed to the limits? Does it make you more honest? Or does it make you more desperate? And as the sweat trickled down their faces, their hands tightly gripping the edge of the sauna seat, the real work began. The true test of a Viking leader wasn't just about how they could withstand the sauna. It was about how they could navigate the heat of diplomacy when the stakes were high. Ever wondered what happens when Vikings put rules and protocol into their sauna meetings? It's not just about sweating, it's about respect, tradition, and survival. Tonight we dive into how they made sauna diplomacy as official as it was sweaty. You'd think a sauna would be a chaotic mess, right? It's hot, it's steamy, and everyone's uncomfortable. But no, the Vikings had a way of making even this most intimate, heated of environments into a space where rules and protocol mattered. After all, when you're negotiating the future of your people, even in a hot, sweaty room, things need to be kept civil. First, let's talk about the invitation. If you were invited to a sauna meeting by a Viking leader, it wasn't just a casual affair, it was a sign of respect and an invitation to discuss serious matters. Getting into that sauna wasn't as easy as just showing up. No, it was an honor to be there. You had to be a trusted ally or an important rival with whom peace had to be negotiated. Your presence meant you had a seat at the table, or, in this case, on the hot wooden benches. Once you were inside, the rules of decorum kicked in. The sauna wasn't a place for loud, uncontrolled anger or insults. It was a place where the Vikings expected you to endure, to show your mental strength just as much as your physical one. And in this hot, humid space, everything that went unsaid mattered as much as what was spoken. You might think that a room full of people sweating and uncomfortable would lead to chaos. But the Vikings had a code of conduct when it came to sauna diplomacy. For one, the host of the sauna always maintained control. They were the one who set the tone, kept the conversation going, and ensured that no one crossed the line. The Vikings also had a few unspoken rules. For example, the conversation was always focused. You didn't talk about trivial things like the weather or your latest raids. No, this was about serious business, whether it was land negotiations, marriage alliances, or agreements over tribal resources. The sauna was the place for business, and the outcome had to be as clear as possible. If you were caught arguing too, loudly or showing signs of disrespect in the sauna, it wasn't just embarrassing, it could be deadly. The Vikings took these negotiations seriously. A poorly handled sauna meeting could lead to broken alliances and bloodshed. You were there to negotiate a peaceful outcome, not to make enemies out of potential allies. Now, let's talk about the physical aspect of these meetings. You weren't just expected to sit there and sweat, you were expected to endure. The heat wasn't meant to be uncomfortable in the sense that you would burn out. No, it was a mental test. The Vikings believed that a person's ability to remain calm and collected under the oppressive heat showed their true strength of character. If you could last in the sauna, sweat pouring down your face, muscles aching from the heat, and still maintain your composure, it meant you could handle whatever trouble or diplomatic pressure came your way. And in true Viking fashion, there was no escape. You couldn't just leave in the middle of a meeting even if the heat became unbearable. That would show weakness, and the Vikings weren't known for being weak. The sauna meetings were a place to prove yourself, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The longer you lasted, the more respect you earned. What happens when the heat in the sauna isn't just from the stones? Tonight, we dive into the intense, unspoken tension that could turn these hot diplomatic meetings into a battle of wills. Can the sauna diplomacy survive the heat of hostility? The steam is thick, the air heavy, and every Viking in the room is sweating bullets. But it's not just the heat making everyone uncomfortable. The tension in the sauna is palpable, thicker than the steam swirling around you. This isn't just a friendly chat between allies. This is serious Viking diplomacy, and sometimes diplomacy is just a thin veneer over simmering hostility. When you're stuck in a room with your rivals, half naked, drenched in sweat, trying to hammer out a peace agreement, the room's temperature can heighten everything. In a place that's meant to foster understanding, it's easy to see how things can go south. What if one Viking leader starts getting uncomfortably close to breaking his word? What if a sarcastic comment or a sharp glance triggers a flare-up? It happens more than you think. The sauna was as much a place to test strength of character as it was to test patience. The heat made everything feel magnified. One wrong word, one out-of-place movement, and the atmosphere could shift from an exchange of pleasantries to a battle of wills. But the key to surviving in the sauna wasn't just physical strength, it was the ability to remain cool-headed under pressure. And not just physically cool, but mentally cool too. You didn't want to show your anger or impatience. That would be seen as a weakness. Vikings prided themselves on composure, and letting yourself get worked up in a sauna could mean you lost the negotiation. However, as the heat turned up and the steam thickened, the tension wasn't always easy to control. The Vikings, despite their legendary toughness, were still human. The sauna, in its intense atmosphere, had a way of pushing the boundaries of diplomatic behavior. Take, for example, the Viking who just sat through a sauna meeting where a rival chief was making unrealistic demands. He's sitting there sweating under the pressure, trying to keep his composure. But as the sweat drips down his face, so does his patience. His eyes narrow, his muscles tense, and in that moment everything could have turned to chaos. In the heat of the moment, one wrong word could tip the scales. A challenging stare, a sarcastic remark, or even a misstep in negotiating terms could make everything combust. And then the sauna diplomacy would no longer be about peace. It would be about fighting for honor, where the sweat wouldn't be the only thing that poured. The strangest part of all this? Sometimes the heat was the ultimate decider. A Viking who could remain calm while sweating it out under immense pressure would win the respect of the other side, simply because they showed more strength in enduring the sauna than their rival could. At times, the heat itself seemed to trigger conflict. Not the physical heat, but the pressure cooker environment that caused everything to come to a head. After hours in a sauna, tempers flared and nerves wore thin. What was meant to be a diplomatic exchange often felt like a silent duel, where the final winner wasn't always the one with the best negotiating skills, but the one who could last the longest without losing composure. And yet, even as the room began to feel more suffocating, the Vikings didn't just give in to the hostility. They didn't shout. They didn't argue openly. They held their ground, let the pressure build, and worked through it until finally a resolution emerged. This was the true nature of Viking diplomacy. Tough, tense, but ultimately about enduring. The heat of the moment, literally and figuratively. It's getting hot in here. What happens when Viking diplomacy moves from tense silence to full-blown action? Tonight, we step inside the sauna as the Vikings turn the heat into a battle of negotiation, and you'll never believe how it all goes down. The steam is suffocating, the heat unbearable, and yet the Vikings press on. The meeting has officially crossed over from uncomfortable sweat to full-blown action. You can feel the intensity as you sit there in the sauna, shoulders hunched, trying to maintain some form of composure, while rivals stare each other down in the smothering heat. The silence between them is no longer the polite, reserved quiet of a diplomatic meeting. It's thick with suspense, the kind of tension that could snap with the smallest wrong word. You watch as the Vikings keep their eyes forward, their faces flushed with both the heat and the mental strain. No one speaks, not yet, but it's clear that the air is charged with expectation. What makes a sauna session different from any regular meeting is the forced closeness. The Viking leaders are practically shoulder to shoulder, sweating buckets, trying to maintain a level of dignity that's almost impossible under these conditions. How do you maintain your pride when you're practically sweating into your own boots, surrounded by rivals who are doing the same? Well, the Vikings have their ways. First, there's the gestures. Vikings didn't rely on long speeches or drawn-out arguments. It's all in the subtlety of their movements. A leader might gently adjust the position of their body, facing away, just a little more from the other party, signaling a shift in power. Or perhaps a slight eye movement catching their rival off guard could indicate the negotiation is shifting in their favor. And then there's the silent war. Each Viking leader knows the power of silence in these tense moments. They might hold their gaze just a little too long, as if challenging the other to speak first. Or they might remain completely still, letting the sweat run down their brow, making the other party question if they're about to crack. But just as you think this is going nowhere, one of the Viking leaders suddenly shifts. He leans forward, breaking the silence, his voice cool despite the heat. Enough of this sweat, enough of this waiting. We've come here to settle our differences, not sit in silence like cowards. The tension in the room breaks. The other Viking, now on the defensive, can't help but respond, albeit with a slow nod of agreement. It's not about making peace in that exact moment. It's about breaking that unspoken barrier, letting the negotiation move forward. In the sauna, everything changes when the quiet is finally broken. Voices rise, though not too loudly. Remember, you're still in a sauna, and the deal-making starts. They discuss terms, trade goods, and consider alliances, but always through the haze of heat. Their words are measured and their actions deliberate. In the sauna, there's no room for games. What's said in here is binding, and it's an exchange, as unpredictable as the steam swirling around. It's fascinating how this small, steamy room can hold so much power. It's in these moments, when heat meets hostility, that you realize Viking diplomacy wasn't just about the words they spoke. It was about the way they endured the pressure, how they maintained their composure in the face of unbearable heat. It's the perfect example of Viking strength, both physical and mental. And finally, after what feels like hours of negotiating, it happens. The deal is struck. Sweat-covered hands are extended, shaking firmly in the midst of the stifling heat, signaling the end of the sauna diplomacy. But as the leaders step out of the sauna, exhausted but satisfied, they know one thing for certain. This sauna wasn't just a meeting. It was a trial of endurance, one that will be remembered for generations. Ever thought negotiating in a sauna could be survival of the fittest? Well, it's time to dive deeper into the Viking sauna diplomacy, where sweat isn't just about discomfort, it's about survival. Let's see how high the stakes really are when lives and futures are on the line. You've survived the sauna. The steam has dissipated and the hot air has become tolerable. But here's the kicker. Sweating it out wasn't just a metaphor. In Viking diplomacy, the heat was part of the test, and it was a test that went far beyond just being uncomfortable. It was about seeing how far you could push your limits before your resolve cracked. Imagine being there, sitting in a sauna where the heat presses in from all sides. It's not just about talking business, it's about surviving the environment, the sweat dripping down your face, and the heavy, muggy air suffocating you. The Vikings knew that this was a test of endurance. It wasn't enough to have a sharp mind or clever words. You had to prove you had the stamina to endure the discomfort, to outlast the heat as well as your rivals. For Vikings, this wasn't just a matter of pride, it was a matter of survival. Leaders who could withstand the sauna's punishing heat were seen as strong, resilient, and worthy of respect. You couldn't make a peace agreement or sign a treaty if you weren't tough enough to handle the physical and mental pressure. Every drop of sweat was a test of your character, and those who showed weakness in the sauna were often seen as weak in leadership too. But survival in the sauna didn't just come from staying calm in the heat. No, it was about how you reacted under pressure. The heat had a way of breaking down defenses. It made everything feel more intense. Every word spoken, every deal struck, it all felt magnified in that oppressive, suffocating atmosphere. At its core, Viking diplomacy in the sauna was about endurance. It wasn't about quick solutions or fast compromises. It was about proving that you could stay focused and clear-headed while your body and mind were being pushed to their absolute limits. Who could stand the longest? Who could negotiate without breaking down under the heat? For many Vikings, the sauna was the ultimate survival test, but there was one more layer to it. The negotiations weren't just about getting what you wanted from your opponent. They were about outlasting them in every sense, physically, emotionally, and strategically. The person who could sit in the sauna the longest, who could sweat it out while staying sharp, had the upper hand when the deal was finally made. In fact, some Vikings even believed that the heat of the sauna had a spiritual component. Enduring the sauna wasn't just about physical survival, it was also about proving your worthiness to the gods. It was thought that if you could survive the heat, if you could push through the discomfort, you were more likely to gain favor with the gods, more likely to win a battle or survive a tough situation. This idea of survival wasn't just symbolic, it had real-world consequences. The Vikings understood that their world was harsh. It was a world where physical strength was important, but mental endurance was just as vital. And the sauna in Hush, all its sweaty glory, was a perfect training ground to test both. As the steam began to clear and the sauna doors were opened, you could feel the weight lift from your chest. The negotiations were over. The deal was struck. And though you might have thought it was just a sweaty encounter, it was far from it. The Vikings had survived, and in that sweat, that discomfort, that intense heat, they had proven their strength, both in body and spirit. What if I told you the sauna was more than just a place to sweat? It was a ritual, a powerful test of will and endurance that went beyond the physical. Let's dive into the true power of the Viking sauna ritual and how it became a cornerstone of their culture. The sauna wasn't just a meeting place for the Vikings. It was in many ways a ritualistic experience that served as a physical and spiritual test. The steam, the heat, the sweat, it all carried profound significance. It wasn't about getting clean or simply cooling off after a battle. For the Vikings, the sauna represented something deeper, a way to test their inner strength, a rite of passage, and a tool for transformation. Imagine stepping into a sauna after a long journey. You're tired, sore, and ready for rest, but instead you're confronted with the intense heat. The air is thick and every breath feels heavy. The Vikings saw this as more than just a physical challenge. It was about surrendering yourself to the elements, accepting the discomfort and learning to master it. This was a test of mental discipline. If you could withstand the oppressive heat without losing your temper, without giving in to frustration, then you proved your mental endurance. And this wasn't just about personal growth, it was about proving yourself to the community. The Vikings were a tribal society, and to maintain respect among the group, you had to show that you could endure hardship. This meant enduring the sauna. But it wasn't just endurance for endurance's sake. The Vikings believed that the sauna served a spiritual purpose. To survive the heat was to show the gods that you had the strength to withstand anything, that you could face adversity without faltering. In Viking culture, strength wasn't just about physical ability, it was about having the inner strength to deal with whatever life threw at you, and that strength was tested in the sauna. The ritual wasn't just about sitting and sweating, though. There was a ceremony to the sauna. When Vikings entered the sauna, they prepared themselves mentally. They prayed to the gods for strength, offering thanks for their blessings or requesting guidance for difficult times. The heat served as a metaphorical and literal cleansing process. It was believed that the sweat released in the sauna purified the body and soul, washing away not just the grime from a long day, but the worries, the fears, and even the spiritual burdens carried from battle. As the steam billowed, the heat would get to your head, making everything feel a little fuzzier, a little more distant. In this altered state, the Vikings believed they could connect with the divine in a way that wasn't possible in their day-to-day lives. It was a time for reflection, a moment to be stripped down, to be vulnerable, and to prepare for whatever came next, whether that was a battle or a negotiation. But not everyone survived the sauna. It wasn't a guarantee that you'd make it through the heat, and some Vikings would leave the sauna defeated, unable to handle the physical strain or the mental pressure. This failure, though, wasn't necessarily seen as weakness. It was simply an opportunity for growth. The Vikings didn't see failure as something to be ashamed of, but rather as part of the learning process. The real power of the sauna ritual wasn't just about what it did to your body, it was about what it did to your mind. The sauna brought clarity, as the heat stripped away the distractions and forced you to focus solely on the present. It made you face yourself, your limits, and your abilities. And in this environment, decisions were made, alliances were formed, and even wars were averted. What happens when silence becomes the loudest part of the room? Tonight, we explore the power of silence in Viking saunas, where words weren't always necessary to make important decisions. Sometimes the quiet spoke louder than anything else. In the midst of the sweltering heat, when the air was thick with steam, the most surprising thing wasn't the sweat or the straining muscles. It was the silence. You'd think a sauna full of Vikings, all sweating and uncomfortable, would be full of chatter, right? Wrong. In fact, silence was often the most powerful tool used in these heated negotiations. It's strange, isn't it? You'd expect these tense, high-stakes meetings to be filled with shouted demands, heated arguments, or maybe even loud gestures. But in Viking saunas, it was the opposite. The most important discussions often happened in quiet, in stillness, as the steam wrapped around them. This silence was not uncomfortable, though. It was loaded with meaning. You're sitting there sweating alongside a rival leader. Both of you are drenched, but neither speaks. There's no need to argue. The sauna, with its oppressive heat and discomfort, forces you to think before you speak. You realize that in this moment, every word counts, and the power of silence allows you to weigh your words carefully, without the rush of emotions or the heat of the moment. In fact, silence in the sauna wasn't just an absence of speech, it was a strategic pause. The Vikings understood the weight of silence. It gave them a chance to gather their thoughts, to reassess the situation without the distractions of the outside world. In this forced quiet, it was easier to tune into the underlying tension of the meeting, the things that were unsaid, the hidden motives of their rivals. Silence in this context wasn't passive. It was active, a space for reflection, for reading, the room for understanding the unspoken. Sometimes silence was also a tactical tool. When one Viking leader would pause and say nothing, it would force the other leader to speak first. The Vikings knew that in moments of uncertainty, it was the one who broke the silence who lost the upper hand. The ability to remain quiet, to endure the heat and discomfort without speaking, became a symbol of control. In many ways, the silence in the sauna mirrored the mental discipline of the Vikings. Their world was filled with constant threats, battles, and danger. But in the sauna, they could pause, take a moment to think deeply and reflect on their next move without rushing into action. Silence in this space gave them clarity and foresight. But silence didn't just represent control, it also allowed the Vikings to read between the lines. In the sauna, you could tell a lot from someone's body language. A slight shift in posture, a subtle glance, or the way someone avoided looking you in the eye. All of these were silent signals that could speak louder than words. And in a room where talking too much could be a liability, these nonverbal cues became the true currency of the negotiation. Silence also gave the Vikings time to reflect on the gravity of their decisions. Negotiations in the sauna weren't just about gaining an advantage, they were about ensuring peace, about ensuring that their people would survive the challenges ahead. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, and it wasn't something to be decided in the heat of the moment. It required the clarity that only silence could provide. After the heat, what comes next? A relief, perhaps, or a final test? Tonight, we explore what happens when the steam begins to clear and the Viking leaders finally cool down. Is it a moment of peace or just another test of strength? After what feels like an eternity of sweating, the steam begins to clear, and the room cools down just a little. The temperature drops enough for you to take a full breath without feeling like the air itself is thick enough to drown you. The Vikings have endured the heat, the sweat, the pressure. Now it's time for the cool down, the moment where the tension finally begins to unwind. But this isn't the peaceful moment you might expect. In fact, the cool down is just as crucial as the heat. While the sauna's oppressive heat forced everyone to sweat out their frustrations, it also allowed them to make decisions in a pressure cooker environment. Now that the heat is starting to lift, you realize that cooling down doesn't mean the deal is done. No, this is the time when things can either fall apart or be sealed with respect. The Viking leaders still sit side by side, still drenched, in sweat, but now the atmosphere is different. The intense pressure of the sauna has passed, but the subtle power dynamics remain. This is the moment when the final terms of the agreement are made. And though the heat may be gone, the mental endurance required to seal the deal has only just begun. You watch as one leader shifts in his seat, clearly relieved by the drop in temperature, but still careful in his movements. He knows that the cool down is more than just physical. It's a moment of reflection, a chance to take stock of what's been said and what still needs to be said. This is when the Vikings would start to finalize the details. They wouldn't just rush out of the sauna with a handshake. No, the cool down was about ensuring that everyone involved left satisfied, with clear agreements, with promises made, and with the understanding that whatever had been discussed in that sauna was now sealed. The power of the cool down wasn't just about relaxing, it was about keeping the negotiations alive, making sure that the discussions didn't end in frustration or confusion. By giving everyone a chance to cool off, the Vikings ensured that the terms of their deal were final and would withstand the pressure of time. The sweat, the steam, the silence, and the heat had all been a part of the negotiation. But now was the time to close it out with a calm and measured finality. But as you observe, the cool down also served another purpose. It was a moment to gauge each other's reactions. The real strength of Viking diplomacy wasn't always in the heated moments. It was in the ability to read the room. After the temperature dropped, did one of the leaders look too relaxed, too eager to leave? Could their body language give away whether they had a hidden agenda? In some ways, the cool down was the most revealing part of the sauna diplomacy. It was in these final moments that the true intentions of the parties were revealed. And often, the Vikings would rely on these subtle signals to either seal the deal or pull back. if they felt the other party wasn't entirely sincere. As the sauna's heat dissipates and the Vikings sit in the cooling room, it's clear that this is the final test. The sauna has done its job. The sweat has been poured out, the decisions have been made, and now it's just about getting out of the sauna with a final handshake and the knowledge that, for now, peace has been secured. What happened after the sweat dried and the steam cleared? Did Viking sauna diplomacy change the course of history? Tonight we dive into how this unusual diplomatic tactic left a lasting legacy and what it tells us about Viking resilience. As the final traces of steam evaporate and the last beads of sweat dry on the Viking leaders' brows, the real power of the sauna diplomacy begins to take shape. The deal is done. The leaders stand, still weary from the heat, but with a sense of satisfaction, perhaps not from comfort, but from the hard-earned peace they've forged in the most uncomfortable of places. You realize that these sauna meetings weren't just a quirky tradition or a weird Viking ritual. They were a test of willpower, a way for the Vikings to navigate the complexities of diplomacy with a level of resilience unmatched by any other culture. The sauna wasn't just about being hot and sweaty for the sake of it. It was about enduring the physical strain of heat, mental strain, and the overwhelming discomfort of negotiating while drenched in sweat, all to achieve something. Far more important, peace and cooperation. But the lasting legacy of this practice went far beyond the immediate result of sealing a deal. It was about the cultural values it reinforced: patience, perseverance, and mental fortitude. The Vikings believed that anything worth achieving required endurance. Whether it was a raid, a new alliance, or a peace agreement, success was measured by your ability to outlast adversity and remain steadfast under pressure. And the sauna, with its unrelenting heat, embodied this philosophy. It was a place where Vikings showed their worth, not by out-talking their rivals, but by outlasting them. It wasn't the strongest Viking who won. It was the one who could withstand the most discomfort without faltering. Over time, the story of the Viking sauna diplomacy spread, and its legacy was woven into the fabric of Viking culture. The sauna became a sacred space, one that symbolized the strength of unity. It wasn't just about physical power, it was about building alliances that could stand the test of time, much like the enduring nature of the sauna itself. The sauna represented the idea that the most lasting connections were those forged under intense pressure, where both parties were forced to sweat it out and face the challenges of negotiation with patience and humility. Even as Viking society evolved and new forms of diplomacy took shape, the spirit of sauna diplomacy endured. In fact, historians argue that the practice shaped Viking attitudes toward conflict resolution long after the sauna was no longer the central meeting place. It left behind a legacy of understanding that sometimes, to achieve the greatest goals, one must be willing to endure, to become uncomfortable, and to forge through the heat. The Vikings, always looking for an edge in every battle, had found a way to win not just through combat, but through patience, endurance, and mutual respect. Their ability to endure hardship, even in the heat of the moment, gave them an advantage that lasted far longer than the sweat-drenched hours spent in the sauna. And so, the story of Viking sauna diplomacy, a sweaty, intense, and oddly sacred practice, was passed down through generations, becoming more than just a quirky chapter in Viking history. It became a symbol of how the most resilient people can thrive in the most uncomfortable situations, proving that sometimes diplomacy isn't just about talking, it's about outlasting the heat. From Viking saunas to modern boardrooms, how does ancient diplomacy meet today's fast-paced world? Tonight we explore how the timeless lessons of sauna diplomacy can be applied in modern life. Will we still sweat it out under pressure, or have we learned a new way to negotiate? As we step away from the Viking sauna and into the modern world, you might be wondering, does the essence of sauna diplomacy still have a place today? Can we still apply the lessons learned from sitting in that steam-filled room to our own high-stakes negotiations? In the modern world, we no longer sweat it out in wooden saunas to strike deals or forge alliances. The world has moved from sauna diplomacy to power lunches, conference calls, and video chats. But still, the essence of those ancient meetings holds valuable lessons. The first thing that stands out is the idea of endurance. Today, we're often faced with challenges that require us to be just as resilient as the Vikings once were. We might not be sitting in a sauna, but we face stressful situations in the office, with family, or in business, where the pressure is just as real. So, what did the Vikings know that we might have forgotten? Viking diplomacy taught us that, sometimes, the most important decisions are made under pressure. In the sauna, it wasn't the strongest who won the negotiation. It was the one who could handle the discomfort and keep their composure. And in a world where stress and deadlines seem constant, that lesson remains just as powerful. Today, when we face tough situations, whether it's a corporate negotiation, a difficult conversation, or a high-pressure moment, what matters most is our mental endurance. How well can we handle the pressure? Can we stay calm and make the right decisions when the stakes are high? The Viking sauna reminds us that physical discomfort often serves as a metaphor for life's struggles. The more we endure, the stronger we become. And it's not just about sitting through discomfort, it's about embracing it. The sauna was a place where the Vikings could reflect and take stock of their decisions. In our modern world, this lesson is more relevant than ever. Taking time to reflect before responding, whether in a heated conversation or a complex business deal, can give us the clarity to make more effective decisions. But there's another lesson from the sauna that we often forget: the importance of silence. In Viking diplomacy, silence played a crucial role in understanding each other's position, allowing both sides to weigh their options and prepare for the next move. Today, we are often so focused on speaking up that we forget the power of silence in negotiations. Taking a pause, letting the conversation breathe, allows us to reflect and understand what's truly at stake. Even more than that, silence shows strength. The ability to remain calm and listen carefully during a negotiation, to let the other party speak their mind without interrupting, reflects a deep sense of control and confidence. It's a powerful tool, one that can help us reach better solutions without the need for constant back and forth. As we move into the digital age, the Viking sauna diplomacy may seem like a relic of the past, but the principles it taught are still highly relevant. We may no longer gather in hot, sweaty rooms to hash out deals, but the lessons of patience, resilience, and mental endurance apply in every aspect of modern life. Whether we're dealing with stressful work situations, personal struggles, or difficult decisions, the core lesson remains the same. Survive the heat, stay focused, and always strive to find resolution. So next time you find yourself in a high-pressure situation, remember the Vikings. You might not have a sauna to sweat it out in, but you can still carry the spirit of their ancient diplomacy with you. Stay cool under pressure, endure the heat, and let the calmness of reflection guide your next move. How can we bridge the gap between Viking sauna diplomacy and our fast-paced world? Tonight, we explore how the timeless principles of sweat and endurance still shape modern-day negotiations, and why sometimes we still need to sweat it out. As we transition from Viking history to modern-day practices, it's clear that the core principles of sauna diplomacy are not as outdated as we might think. In fact, some of the most powerful business deals, personal negotiations, and political agreements still rely on techniques that have their roots in ancient practices, where patience and endurance were just as important as skill or strategy. In the modern world, we don't necessarily gather in saunas to discuss business, but we still face the same pressures that the Vikings did. Today, we're often caught in high-stakes situations, whether it's finalizing a deal, making tough decisions, or simply navigating tense negotiations. The stress is real, and in those moments it's easy to become overwhelmed, just as Vikings did when they sat in the sweltering heat of the sauna. But what did the Vikings understand about stress and decision-making under pressure that we might not have embraced yet? The answer is resilience. Vikings didn't shy away from tough situations. Instead, they embraced them, knowing that in the most difficult moments, the strongest negotiators are those who remain composed, even when the world around them is getting hotter. In modern times, we face a similar test. When everything is on the line, can we stay calm? Can we endure the discomfort just like the Vikings did in the sauna to come to the best decision? Endurance under pressure is the key to success in our fast-moving world. Whether you're in a high-pressure meeting, dealing with family tensions, or handling a crisis at work, the ability to withstand discomfort without breaking, without rushing to a decision, is the modern form of sauna diplomacy. Interestingly, the lessons of sauna diplomacy can also teach us about conflict resolution in the digital age. Today we might message, email, or video conference to handle negotiations, but the emotional distance can make it harder to read the subtle signals that would otherwise be apparent in person. The Vikings, however, knew that the heat of the moment, be it in the sauna or on the battlefield, taught them how to read body language and understand what was left unsaid. The Vikings didn't just negotiate over a cup of mead, they read the room. They understood that sometimes true communication didn't come from what was said, but from how someone reacted under pressure. In the same way, we must learn to pay attention to non-verbal cues, like how someone is acting in the midst of stress, to better gauge their true intentions. Another lesson we can learn from Viking sauna diplomacy is the importance of taking time, pausing, rather than rushing decisions. The Vikings, in their sauna meetings, didn't just jump into deals. They sat, they sweat, and they reflected. It was an opportunity to pause and think, something that's often missing in today's fast-paced world. The Viking approach shows us that taking a moment to breathe, to slow down the conversation, and to think through the consequences of a decision can lead to much better outcomes in the long run. But just as in Viking times, when the sauna doors opened and the steam cleared, the final decision needed to be strong and clear. While the Vikings may have used the sauna to negotiate peace, we can still apply their principles in modern diplomacy. The art of negotiation, whether it's about business deals, international relations, or personal decisions, often involves more than words. It's about enduring, remaining calm, and reading the signals in times of stress. As you move through your day, think about the principles of Viking sauna diplomacy. Can you endure the heat? Can you remain composed when the pressure is on? In those moments, it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving and using the heat to your advantage. Whether you're sitting in a sauna or navigating a challenging situation in life, sometimes it's the ability to endure that determines the outcome. What if I told you the Vikings had more wisdom than just their swords? Tonight, we explore how Viking wisdom shaped their diplomacy, and how their ancient practices can still teach us valuable lessons in endurance and decision-making today. When we think of the Vikings, we often think of their infamous raids and fierce warriors, but their true strength lay not just in battle. They were also wise diplomats. Viking diplomacy, especially in the context of their sauna negotiations, wasn't just about aggression. It was about strategy, mental endurance, and the ability to negotiate under pressure. The Viking approach to decision-making wasn't hasty. It wasn't about jumping into conflict and hoping for the best. It was about weighing all the options, reflecting on the situation, and then making the best possible decision in the moment. And that's exactly what their sauna diplomacy teaches us: patience and calm in the face of pressure. In many ways, the Vikings' ability to remain composed during intense situations mirrors what we now call strategic thinking. Just as Viking leaders endured the sauna's heat to maintain their composure, we today need to endure life's stresses, corporate meetings, personal struggles, and high-stakes decisions without letting our emotions run wild. By staying calm, we can think clearly and make better choices. What's fascinating about Viking diplomacy is how they saw the world. For them, everything had a balance. Peace didn't mean weakness, and war didn't mean strength. The Vikings understood that both sides of the spectrum, calm and conflict, were necessary to maintain order and stability. Sauna diplomacy was a balance of strength and restraint, proving that the smartest move wasn't always the most obvious or the most immediate. The Vikings also understood the importance of honoring tradition. Their sauna rituals, passed down through generations, weren't just about physical endurance. They were about connecting to something larger than themselves. They believed that wisdom came not just from knowledge, but from experience and the ability to adapt. Whether it was a trade negotiation or a battle for land, The Vikings relied on a deep understanding of their world, their land, their people, and their enemies. And just as the Vikings respected their ancestral traditions, we today must learn to respect the traditions that have shaped our own societies and cultures. The Viking sauna wasn't just about negotiating a deal, it was about honoring the wisdom passed down through the generations. It was about connecting to the past while making decisions that would shape the future. This balance between tradition and progress is something that remains relevant to this day. Perhaps the most important lesson the Vikings offer us is that true wisdom isn't just about what we know, it's about how we apply that knowledge. In their saunas, the Vikings didn't just pass the time. They used the opportunity to think deeply about their actions, their alliances, and their future. They took time to reflect, and only then did they act. In today's world, where everything moves so fast, we could all learn a little from the Viking way of thinking. Taking time to pause, to reflect, and to make thoughtful decisions can often lead to better outcomes than rushing into a choice. By understanding their own limitations, both physical and mental, the Vikings became the masters of their environment. Whether it was battling, diplomacy, or trade, they knew that their greatest strength lay in their ability to stay calm, think strategically, and endure the most difficult situations. The sauna, in all its heat and discomfort, became the perfect test for this inner strength. So the next time you're faced with a tough decision or a stressful situation, remember the Vikings. Think about the sauna, about endurance, about reflecting before acting. Take a moment to breathe, to step back, and to weigh your options. Like the Vikings, you too can face the heat and come out victorious. What happens when the mythical becomes real? Tonight we dive into the fascinating world of mythical creatures, like the spider, and how these creatures came to symbolize much more than just nature. They were reflections of Viking culture, power, and creativity. Throughout history, mythical creatures have always been more than just legends. They've been symbols, representing deep aspects of culture, nature, and the human experience. And for the Vikings, mythical creatures weren't just things of folklore. They were woven into their daily lives, influencing everything from art to diplomacy to their view of the world. One of the most intriguing of these creatures is the spider, often misunderstood as just a small creeping insect. But for the Vikings, the spider symbolized far more. You see, the Vikings didn't just see a spider as an annoying pest. They saw it as a weaver of fate, a craftsman of intricate webs. Much like the way they wove their own destinies, the spider became a symbol of control, a reflection of the weaving that permeated their world, from physical crafts like weaving cloth to the metaphysical weaving of fate itself. Arachne, the mortal who challenged Athena in the myth, was transformed into a spider after her defeat. But instead of seeing this transformation as a mere punishment, the Vikings saw it as a reinvention. The spider, trapped in an eternal act of weaving, became an embodiment of perseverance and creativity. Much like the Vikings themselves, the spider's fate was not one of defeat, but of endless creation. The spider's web, intricate and complex, reflected the Viking view of the world. The Vikings were no strangers to interconnectedness. Their entire society was built on networks of trade, alliances, kinship, and war. The spider's web mirrored this complexity. Every thread in the web represented a decision, a choice, a connection that could either strengthen or weaken the entire structure. Just like the webs of diplomacy woven in the sauna, where each word, each pause, each gesture had consequences that stretched beyond the immediate situation. But what made the spider so fascinating to the Vikings was how it turned weakness into strength. The spider wasn't a creature that relied on brute force or violence to survive. It thrived in the silence, using delicate threads and patience to capture what it needed. The spider's grace under pressure and its ability to adapt in the most challenging environments made it a perfect symbol for Viking endurance, both physically and mentally. The spider's role in Viking mythology also came with a deeper spiritual connection. It wasn't just about survival or crafting, it was about control over one's fate. The Vikings understood that while they may not always control the events that occurred around them, they could control how they reacted, how they endured, and how they weaved their way through life's challenges. The spider's ability to craft something beautiful from seemingly insignificant threads spoke to the Viking ideal of transforming hardship into something meaningful. In fact, many Viking artifacts, like woven tapestries, depict not just scenes of battle, but also scenes of nature, including spiders and webs. These weren't just decorative, they were reminders of the importance of balance in their world, the balance between war and peace, between action and reflection, and the delicate threads that held their lives and their diplomacy together. And so when Vikings entered their saunas to negotiate, they did so with the spirit of the spider in mind. They weaved their fate with every word, every pause, and every move they made. The sauna wasn't just a test of endurance or strength. It was a space where Viking leaders wove their own tapestries of destiny, just as the spider weaves its web, carefully and intentionally. What if I told you that knitting and craft played a larger role in Viking culture than just clothing? Tonight, we explore how the Vikings' skills in weaving and knitting weren't just for survival. They were key tools in the art of diplomacy, identity, and their connection to the divine. When we think of Vikings, we often picture warriors in armor, fighting on the front lines, or their legendary longships cutting through the seas. But the Vikings were also skilled artisans, and one of their most important crafts was weaving, a craft that carried deep cultural and spiritual meaning. The art of weaving wasn't just about creating garments, it was about connection, identity, and ritual. Weaving and knitting were essential to Viking life, especially during the long, harsh winters when warm clothing was critical for survival. But this wasn't just about function, it was about storytelling. The Vikings didn't just weave cloth for warmth, they wove their myths, their history, and their values into their fabrics. Viking women in particular were known for their skill in weaving intricate tapestries that depicted everything from everyday life to the myths of the gods. These tapestries were more than just decorations. They were a form of storytelling, allowing Vikings to pass down their history and beliefs to the next generation. The designs on their woven fabrics weren't just random patterns. They were symbols, telling stories of gods, heroes, and legendary deeds. Every knot, every thread had meaning. But weaving wasn't just about stories, it was also about identity. The Vikings used their skills in knitting and weaving as a way to express who they were and where they came from. The designs on their garments and tapestries often carried specific tribal marks and symbols of their ancestry. By wearing these woven pieces, Vikings could display their heritage, family ties, and allegiances to other tribes. It was a way of claiming ownership of their place in Viking society. But it wasn't just practical or decorative. For the Vikings, weaving was also a spiritual act. The act of weaving was often connected to the gods, especially to Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and weaving. It was said that Freya taught women how to weave, and that the spirit of the loom was as powerful as the spirit of the gods themselves. The Vikings believed that weaving could bring them closer to the divine, as it allowed them to connect with the threads of fate that controlled their lives. In fact, weaving was so sacred that it wasn't just about making clothes, it was about shaping the future. Vikings believed that by weaving they were actively weaving their own fate, threading together their destiny. Each knot represented a moment in time, and every piece of cloth created was part of the greater tapestry of their lives. For Viking leaders, the ability to weave wasn't just a practical skill, it was a symbol of power and a reflection of their control over their fate. And so when the Vikings met in their saunas to discuss matters of diplomacy, they didn't just talk. They weaved their futures together, choosing their words as carefully as they would choose the threads for a tapestry. The sauna diplomacy wasn't just about sitting in the heat and sweating it out, it was about crafting something lasting. Much like the act of weaving, diplomacy required delicate care and strategic decisions. Vikings understood that diplomacy, like weaving, wasn't a quick process. It was about patience, about threading together a relationship that could stand the test of time even through the most intense heat. The strength of a woven fabric wasn't in the individual threads, it was in how they were combined, how each strand contributed to something stronger. And so, Just as they carefully crafted garments and tapestries that told stories and protected them from the elements, the Vikings crafted their alliances and diplomatic relationships in the same deliberate, careful manner. They understood that, in both art and diplomacy, strength came not from brute force but from carefully woven connections. What if every decision you made was like adding a new thread to the fabric of your life? Tonight, we explore how Viking diplomacy and the act of weaving were intricately linked, with each decision and conversation forming part of the tapestry of fate. When we talk about Viking diplomacy, we often think of tactical brilliance and battle tactics, but there's something far deeper at play, something as delicate and powerful as the threads of a tapestry. For the Vikings, diplomacy wasn't just about forcing an agreement. It was about weaving relationships, carefully creating a future that could withstand the tests of time, just like a carefully crafted woven fabric. The metaphor of weaving was embedded deeply in Viking culture. Every conversation, every alliance, and every negotiation was like a new thread being added to the fabric of fate. The Vikings understood that their futures were not just shaped by battle and conquests, but by how they interacted with each other, how they wove together the complex patterns of power, trust, and survival. In this way, diplomacy was like the work of a weaver. Each decision, each gesture, each carefully chosen word was a delicate thread, and it was the responsibility of the Viking leaders to choose their actions carefully. Much like a weaver crafting a complex design, they had to consider how each choice would impact the larger tapestry of their world. They knew that once a thread was woven into the fabric, it couldn't be easily undone. Similarly, once a deal was struck or an alliance made, the consequences would be woven into the destiny of their people. In a Viking sauna, where negotiations took place, the heat and discomfort could cloud the mind. But even in the sauna's most challenging moments, the Vikings were still weaving, crafting their future with every word spoken, every gesture made. In the same way a weaver pays attention to the details, the Vikings paid attention to the small, subtle interactions that would determine the strength of their relationships. The Vikings understood that just as a single thread could make or break the integrity of a fabric, so too could a single word or action shape the outcome of a negotiation. Trust was the thread that bound these relationships, and a single betrayal could unravel everything they had worked for. And it wasn't just about alliances with other tribes. It was about creating a legacy, a pattern of decisions that would influence the future generations. The Vikings believed that the fabric of life was woven not just by the present, but by how each generation added to it. Every negotiation was part of this ongoing process of weaving the future, ensuring that each new thread fit into the larger design of Viking culture and survival. The Vikings also understood that some threads were stronger than others. Loyalty was the strongest thread of all, the one that tied people together and kept their society strong. Without loyalty, the fabric of Viking civilization would fall apart. Just like in weaving, it wasn't just about adding more threads, it was about making sure the right ones were intertwined in the right way. As the Vikings engaged in sauna, diplomacy, they also wove their fates together with the people they interacted with. Every gesture, every word, was a strand in the web of relationships they were building. Whether it was a peaceful alliance or a tense truce, each meeting was a chance to add strength to their world, to create a bond that could withstand future conflicts, challenges, and threats. Through this metaphor of weaving, the Vikings understood that diplomacy wasn't about domination. It was about balance. It was about taking the time to weave together the many complex threads that made up their society and relationships, knowing that each decision added a new layer to the tapestry of their people's fate. What if I told you that every small detail in Viking diplomacy had a direct impact on the larger outcome? Tonight we dive into the delicate balance of Viking negotiations, where every sweat drop, every word and every gesture mattered more than you might think. Viking diplomacy was not about sweeping gestures or grand speeches, it was about the details. Every decision, every action, no matter how small, played a crucial role in the success or failure of negotiations. And in the sauna, where sweat dripped and steam filled the air, every word spoken and every move made could shift the balance of power. Viking leaders understood that small details, those moments when the heat was at its highest, could determine whether a truce would hold or an alliance would break. Imagine sitting in that sauna, beads of sweat trickling down your face, trying to remain composed while your rival sits across from you. The temperature is unbearable, but it's the details of the conversation that weigh most heavily on your mind. It's not just the broad strokes of the deal that matter, it's the subtle nuances. The way a leader adjusts their posture, the way they make eye contact or avoid it, and the small, almost imperceptible pauses in the conversation, all of these signals were critical to the outcome of the negotiation. In Viking diplomacy, silence could speak as loudly as words. A pause could be an invitation to speak more, or it could be a way to show that you were not easily rattled by the heat. The way you held your ground in that moment of discomfort said just as much about your strength as any well-thought-out speech could. The Vikings knew that how you carried yourself in the sauna, how you endured the heat, was a reflection of your resolve and your commitment to the negotiation. These small details were particularly important because the Vikings valued directness, but they also understood that patience and restraint often spoke louder. They had a deep understanding of human nature, and in those tense sauna meetings, they knew that rushing into decisions could ruin the deal. By carefully observing the small signals, the pauses in the conversation, and the shifting of bodies, they could gauge the true intentions of their rivals or allies. And then there was the physical aspect, the sweat itself. Every drop that dripped down the face of a Viking leader was a test. It wasn't just the heat, it was the pressure to make the right decision, to negotiate without letting emotions get the best of you. The sweat became a visible representation of the intensity of the moment. The more a leader sweat, the more you knew they were in the heat of the decision. But for those who could stay calm, composed, and in control of their physical state, there was a silent power in that endurance. In the sauna, the Vikings practiced mental discipline. It was a ritual of calming the mind while the body endured the heat. It wasn't just about endurance. It was about the ability to control your thoughts and emotions in the face of discomfort. In many ways, the sauna represented the ultimate test. Could you remain focused and composed when everything around you was pushing you to break down? This focus on small details was reflected in the way Vikings handled diplomatic ties as well. When negotiating peace, every detail mattered. A small gesture of goodwill, like a handshake or a slight nod of the head, could change the direction of the conversation. At the same time, a wrong word, a misstep in etiquette, or a dismissive gesture could undo hours of negotiation. The Vikings understood that their survival depended on how well they managed these tiny interactions. The sweat on your brow isn't just from the heat, it's from the mental strain of maintaining control, of not rushing to conclusions, of being calm and composed while every fiber of your body wants to break down. In Viking diplomacy, the ability to control your body and mind in the sauna was a reflection of your ability to lead, to make difficult decisions under pressure, and to build alliances that would last. It wasn't about being the strongest Viking in the room. It was about being the one who could endure the longest, stay composed the longest, and ultimately craft the best deal, one that would ensure the survival and prosperity of their people. What happens when the sweat has dried and the steam has cleared? The legacy of Viking sauna diplomacy didn't fade with the heat. Let's explore how their endurance and mental strength shaped not only their era, but also their lasting influence on diplomacy today. As the last steam dissipated and the heat of the sauna finally gave way to a cooling breeze, the Viking leaders emerged, not just physically drained, but with a deeper understanding of human resilience and diplomacy. Their time in the sauna was more than just an uncomfortable ordeal. It was a ritual that left a lasting mark on how they negotiated, how they interacted, and how they forged alliances. You might be wondering, how did this sauna diplomacy affect their long-term relationships and society? The answer lies in the way the Vikings turned these sweaty, heated meetings into a cornerstone of their cultural identity. The sauna was more than just a place to negotiate. It was a symbol of the Viking way of life. It embodied their most important virtues: endurance, patience, resilience, and mental toughness. The Vikings didn't just apply this method to their daily negotiations, it became part of their legacy. The reputation of Viking leaders wasn't based solely on their warrior prowess or their raids. It was also shaped by their ability to navigate difficult situations with wisdom and self-control. The sauna wasn't just for the strong, it was for the wise, the ones who could manage the heat of both the sauna and the world around them. And the legacy of this approach wasn't confined to the Vikings. Over the centuries, as their influence spread across Europe and beyond, the principles of endurance under pressure, silent strength, and deliberate decision-making became foundational to how diplomacy evolved in medieval Europe. Viking leaders were among the first to understand that true diplomacy wasn't about speaking the loudest, but about enduring the discomfort of negotiation and coming out the other side with a stronger relationship. The Vikings' sauna diplomacy also had a psychological impact on the way future leaders approached conflict resolution. For centuries, they would be remembered not just for their brutal strength in battle, but for their mental agility in the face of adversity. Negotiations in the sauna were often conducted in silence, where leaders read the room, gauged emotions, and adjusted their strategies without ever having to raise their voices. This concept of silent diplomacy still holds value in today's world, where quiet persistence can sometimes be more effective than loud demands. As the Vikings moved from their homeland and settled in different parts of Europe, their approach to tough situations became a model for emerging cultures. The lessons learned in the sauna about enduring under pressure, facing discomfort with dignity, and staying composed in tense situations became foundational principles in the development of international diplomacy. The legacy of these sweaty, high-stakes sauna meetings wasn't just about peace talks. It was about creating a culture that valued mental toughness just as much as physical strength. As we reflect on the Vikings' diplomatic methods, we realize that the sauna sessions weren't just about negotiating land or goods. They were about testing the character of leaders and building relationships that could withstand the tests of time. These leaders emerged from the sauna not only with peace agreements in hand, but with a deeper understanding of the complexities of human nature, the kind of understanding that lasted through generations. Today, when we face intense negotiations, whether in the boardroom, diplomatic summits, or even personal conversations, the Vikings' method still resonates. We may not have saunas to sweat in, but the principles of endurance, patience, and strategic silence are just as valuable now as they were then. So, the next time you find yourself in a difficult conversation or negotiation, take a deep breath, stay calm, and remember, sometimes the best way to win is simply to endure the discomfort and come out stronger on the other side. What happens when an ancient tradition fades into history? Tonight, we uncover the end of Viking sauna diplomacy and how it was replaced by new methods. But did the spirit of sauna diplomacy live on, or did it vanish with the steam? As the centuries passed, the world began to change. The Vikings, with their warrior-like strength and their unconventional diplomacy, eventually gave way to newer, more formalized methods of negotiation and politics. The sauna diplomacy that had once been the hallmark of Viking peace talks slowly faded into history. The rise of empires and the evolution of international diplomacy meant that the small, steamy rooms where Viking leaders had once sweated it out were no longer the stages for negotiations. The transition from sauna diplomacy to more modern methods wasn't a sudden shift. In fact, it was gradual, a natural progression as society evolved and the need for more structured, formal meetings became necessary. City-states grew larger, and their needs for complex agreements grew more sophisticated. The ritualistic sauna meetings were simply too unpredictable for the new, structured world of diplomacy that was emerging. But the transition wasn't just about changing methods. It was about the Vikings' evolving relationship with the world around them. As the Vikings interacted with other cultures, Christian kingdoms, Islamic caliphates, and other European powers, new forms of diplomacy emerged. The heated rooms of the sauna gave way to official palaces, royal chambers, and banquet halls. Paperwork and written contracts took the place of sweat and silence. Yet, even as sauna diplomacy became a thing of the past, the lessons it taught about endurance, mental fortitude and patience endured. In fact, many of the principles of Viking diplomacy have carried over into the modern world in ways we may not even realize. For example, modern negotiators often talk about keeping their cool during high-stakes conversations. The idea of holding back emotions, taking a moment of pause, and carefully weighing the consequences of each decision still resonates today, much like the Vikings did in their heated meetings. Even the physicality of diplomacy, the idea that one must sometimes endure discomfort to achieve the best outcome, can be traced back to those ancient sauna sessions. Today, we might not sit in saunas, but we still face stressful negotiations, complicated political discussions, and high-pressure situations that require the same level of resilience. And while sauna diplomacy might have disappeared, the Viking spirit of negotiation still lives on. Their ability to withstand adversity and remain composed under pressure remains a lesson that transcends time. The legacy of Viking diplomacy, built on the enduring power of the sauna, continues to influence the way we approach tough conversations, hard decisions, and even everyday challenges. In many ways, Viking sauna diplomacy isn't truly over. It's simply evolved. It has been woven into the tapestry of diplomacy as we know it today. The sweat, the heat, the silence, those moments of reflection and strategy still echo in the rooms where deals are made today. We may no longer need a sauna to test our patience, but we still find ourselves, just like the Vikings, sweating over decisions, enduring discomfort, and trying to weave our way through complex negotiations. And so, the Viking tradition of sauna diplomacy, though long gone, will always remain as part of the foundation of how we approach the world of diplomacy, conflict resolution, and the art of endurance. End of script. Sweet dreams.